Someone once told me the grass is much greener.
Hello everybody, Chocolate Guy here, and welcome back to another countdown. Now, even though As Told by Ginger Season 2 is a very mixed bag with some real stinkers, there are some truly fantastic episodes at the season's best. The season does produce some of the show's best episodes and the most unique that tackle topics I've very rarely seen be tackled in cartoons, pursuing some really complex subject matters that truly did push the television animation medium forward, which the show always had the potential to do. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So, here is my list of the top 5 best As Told by Ginger Season 2 episodes. This episode really is a great showcase of most of the things this season does right, and I expected it to be much higher before rewatching it and realized it does have some problems that put the episode below some others. Still, this episode has such a great story that tackles a very personal struggle for Ginger, but one I could see relating to many kids. And I think this episode perfectly utilizes how dynamic and multifaceted Ginger is as a character to make this story work as well as it does. Ginger is really unlikable in this episode. Like, really unlikable. She guilts Lois into staying with a gross dude she doesn't like, and who is condescending and disrespectful to both of them for really silly reasons that don't hold a lot of weight. But I believe that Ginger believes if her mom isn't seeing someone, she could end up alone and miserable. And she thinks she is doing the right thing by pushing her to stay with Buzz and to put up with him. The episode does such a good job getting into Ginger's head and allowing you to see her rationale as a deep thinking but still naive teenager who puts too much stock into things she enjoys, like daytime dating talk shows. And this perspective is really interesting, especially when you see how Lois responds to it. Lois is happy being single and raising her 2 kids, and doesn't like Buzz, but values her daughter's opinion enough to try and make it work for her. But it creates a really interesting conflict between her and Ginger, where they have to both balance their own wishes based off what they think is best for the other person, and will make that person happy. The situation is just so complex and interesting to see play out for the reasons I've already stated, but it works even better because of Buzz himself. Buzz is such a piece of garbage. He is super condescending and rude to both Ginger and Lois. He says just the right things to be so punchable, and is manipulative in the way he uses his fixes around the house to stay in Lois's good graces, while still not treating her or Ginger super well, and his voting system to seem like he actually cares what the kids think, when, as pointed out, it's set up so he gets what he wants. Having him be this gross and unlikable makes the story work so much better, because you really get to see both Ginger and Lois struggle with this situation even more, and it's interesting seeing how they respond to different stupid things Buzz does, and makes you unsure where the story is gonna go, and who is gonna crack first, and how the aftermath of cutting it off with Buzz will play out. This episode is just so good, and it's really nice to see an episode that has an interesting subject matter that could lead to a dull story, lead to a great one, with so many good character exploring moments, and even some great humor out of how awkward this whole dynamic and situation is. The episode is great, and really just pulls out all the stops for what this show can accomplish when it has its shit together. The reason it is so low is because the Carl plot really doesn't add much, and the much bigger thing is while I like the story and think it's good, and the episode gets a lot out of its concept, it does lose a little steam near the end. and starts to feel like you're just watching the same series of events over and over again. And while the conclusion where Ginger and Lois come to an understanding is good, it's not as compelling or fleshed out as you'd think for how strong the episode is overall and just how complex it is. So yeah, this is a great episode once again, but was edged out by a few others from being higher on the list. Oh, this is another episode I kinda wanted to put higher, but competition was so tight. I love episodes of this show that really get to the root of a complex relationship between characters, and deep dives into rich family or community dynamics. Keep that in mind for later. But this episode has this element in spades, really getting to see who Macy is and the strange relationship she has with her parents. The setup of Macy turning 13 and her friends expecting her to throw a big, great party to celebrate is really good. Macy is a really likable character, and you want to see her have a good experience on this day, but the episode buries the lead enough that you're not super sure watching it the first time where the episode is gonna go with this. And then when Macy's parents forget her birthday, it is so sad, and this nicely leads into getting to see who her parents are and how neglectful they have been. And they get called out in a cool scene that shows just how much Ginger cares for Macy, which sets up a great part of the episode and a really interesting conflict. Firstly, it's just really interesting seeing Macy's relationship with her parents, especially because even though they're neglectful before this point and distant, along with not knowing much about her, you can see how much Macy still respects and appreciates them, which is very different for a story and relationship like this. And it makes it especially compelling when her parents do try to make an effort and treat her like a young child and not a new teenager, because there is such a disconnect. Macy just loves it anyways though, because she appreciates the attention, but it also paints the picture she just loves her parents despite their failings. And this leads to some interesting ideas being discussed of if Macy is actually happy, or if this is just lowered expectations being met, and her just not being a super judgmental person in general. Or if she is only acting this way to please her parents and isn't getting the most out of this relationship, which is how she's always acted. It's especially interesting because Ginger is the one who mostly struggles with all these ideas, which leads to a great conflict between Macy and Ginger, which is what most of the back end actually really focuses on, which is a really good choice in my opinion. It's such an interesting angle to approach this episode from, to have Ginger notice these weird things and feel weird about them, about just how well Macy is taking this whole situation and showcasing her struggle with that, along with getting to see Macy's perspective, especially in response to that as well. And it leads to a really nuanced conflict because on the one hand, Macy shouldn't be treated like she is 5, and in some sense, them treating her like this is not helping her get closer with her family, and it's another weird barrier of distance between them like there has always been. But on the other hand, she is clearly having a good time and appreciates their efforts, and there's nothing wrong with that. And while it's nice that Ginger is looking out for Macy, she jumps to way too many conclusions about how Macy is feeling, when after a while, if Macy says she is feeling one way and wants Ginger to butt out of her personal life a bit, then there's also nothing wrong with that. And the conclusion to all this is a really nice one, with Ginger coming to that conclusion that sometimes butting into someone's personal life too much isn't right, and respecting one friend's judgment, but Macy does simultaneously realize she wants her parents to treat her like the age she is, and she comes to that conclusion on her own. Just such a unique and well done episode that tackles so many different things to create an overall great package. And I haven't even talked about how fun the Carl plot is, and how it breaks up the main story perfectly. It's really weird and fun to see Carl actually afraid of something, especially such a cool and unique animal. And the episode has a lot of fun with this and gets many great scenes and jokes out of it. The reason this episode is so low is despite how unique and interesting it is, while I like the setup, I think it goes on a bit too long, and I wish we got into the exploration of Macy's family dynamic and her conflict with Ginger a lot earlier to flesh it out even more. They definitely could have gone much further with that part of the story, despite how good this episode is. That was enough to bring it down a bit, but this is still easily one of the season's best. So this episode surprised me a lot, because while I liked it, watching it the first time, watching it again for this list, I realized I loved it and think it's great. And it was the first just undeniably great episode of the show. This one just really gets the most out of not only Ginger and Lois's interesting dynamic, but also really picks apart the brain of your average teenager and how that applies to Ginger herself. I just love the story of Ginger getting closer to her mother through her mother taking up this maid job. You really get to see how cool Lois is because she is such a hard worker and doesn't care what anyone thinks about her, but also you get to see that she really cares and goes the extra mile to try and connect with her daughter. The conflict between them is really interesting because even though Ginger is in the wrong and pretty rude and condescending to her mom at points, it's just such a good showcase of how teenagers see people in really specific roles and how they have to fit those roles, and if they don't, it's just the super embarrassing thing. And how depending on their own circumstances and the people they are around, they may look down more on one profession than another. And it's cool to see just how dumb this is, because when Ginger learns to not buy into that stupid way of thinking, she is so much happier and has a better relationship with her mom and just a deeper understanding of who her mom is and why she is such a hard worker and doesn't care about stupid things like that. And she also learns on top of it just how cool her mom can be through her doing this profession that Ginger originally looks down upon and thinks isn't meant for her mom because she's a nurse. This episode doesn't have that strong of a story or narrative, but it doesn't matter because this dynamic is so rich and the episode does such a good job exploring it. You really get to see how embarrassed Ginger is of her mom going on strike and not working, and then later working a different job so the family can get by. But as she learns to appreciate her mom, she really realizes not only the stuff I mentioned earlier, but that her mom is doing all of this for her and for her brother so she can provide for them, and really begins to understand what all that means. She doesn't want to go on strike or work a more manual labor job, but she has to, and Ginger getting embarrassed by this is ridiculous. And that's beautifully demonstrated with the ending to this episode, where Ginger's mom gets hired by Courtney's family to clean their house, and Ginger feels weird about it at first, and at the beginning of the episode would have been absolutely mortified, but ends up joining her on that job and them doing it together, and it ending up not being a big deal at all. She accepts her mother and this situation and just owns all of it, and once again is much happier for it and closer to her mom because of it. It's so sweet, and it's a great way to show how much Ginger has really developed and how close these two have gotten throughout this whole thing. It's all just so fantastic, and the Carl plot isn't bad either. It's pretty cute seeing Carl and Hoodsy trying to train this dog, and there's a lot of really good gags, and it breaks up the main story, which is just a lot of interesting conversations, but nothing super visually interesting, pretty nicely. Though it's nothing that funny or that interesting. With all that said, I think this episode needed to explore Ginger's mindset throughout, or this conflict with her mom, a little more. Because for how good this episode is, it can be a little simple and straightforward in select places. Or they could have done something more interesting with the Carl plot, and any one of these things would have made this episode exceptional, and definitely a contender for the #1 spot. But as it stands, it is great, even though there are still 2 that are better. So this is when the episodes become truly amazing. Losing Nana Bishop was one of the episodes I had always heard about being this amazing watch from the series that you needed to check out, but only sat down to watch it for the first time when I watched the whole show. And I gotta say, it really is something special. Not just because of how it deals with loss, especially the loss of a grandparent you may or may not have had a super close relationship with, and just how complicated that can be. Hoodsy's story is great, and we'll get to that. But this episode is truly fantastic because of how it subverts what you'd expect an episode like this to be about, having Ginger's story lead into her kinda reconnecting with her distant and absent father. There's just a lot to unpack here. Let's start with where the episode itself starts, with Dodie's reaction to her grandma's death. I feel like this is widely considered to be one of the best uses of Dodie. She's not the biggest part of this episode, all things considered, but she comes off as just a normal girl who was really close to her grandma, and is super saddened by her passing, but is appreciative of having friends she can talk to about all this. And through these conversations, we really get to hear about some sweet memories she has with her grandma and learn a bit more about her in general. It really humanizes her as a character. And through this scene, the show also really captures how awkward and kind of difficult moments like this can be at that age when you're helping your friends through a tragic death, but also how rewarding and great it is to be able to be there for someone in such an important moment. It's such a strong way to start the episode, and I think it's such an interesting subversion to use this to actually set up Ginger's complex of trying to learn more about her own deceased grandmother and reconnect with experiences she had with her. It's such a relatable experience, but a really complicated one at that age, to try and reevaluate relationships you either had or have after a tragedy to you or someone you were close with, which leads to one of the best stories of the show. There are so many interesting moments of Ginger trying to learn more about her grandmother, which leads to some amazing conversations where she really connects with her mom, even if Lois didn't love Ginger's grandma, and it also leads to one of the best scenes of the show where she finally gets to have a real conversation with her distant father. And both her and the audience finally get to learn more about his background and get to see such a tragic display of generational family cycles. You can tell he wants to be there for his kids and be better than his own father was towards him, but just isn't, and still really doesn't understand why. But despite this, just being a good enough person and responding when Ginger reaches out to talk to him does lead to her, through trying to learn more about a deceased family member, reconnecting with not only her mom, who she already had a strong relationship with, but with her father as well, whom she starts to talk to more regularly. It's such a great twist, but one that makes sense, and it's a really big change for the show as they continue to develop Joseph's relationship with both his kids. And it really shows the value of reevaluating relationships, former and present, even if they are complicated. Ginger never thought she'd have a relationship with her father because of how distant he has been throughout much of her life. And Joseph never thought he would get another chance to make it all up to her because of how many times he's let her down in the past. But through Ginger reevaluating a totally different relationship, it leads to them reconnecting and both of them being much happier for it, which is such a wonderful thing for kids to see and can be a really powerful and inspiring thing for kids in a similar situation as Ginger. And another message this episode demonstrates through all this is that even in the darkest times, good things, good surprising things can happen. All of this is just so powerful and amazing. But hey, if you thought that story was incredible, the Hoodsie story might be even better. The idea of having a relative who passes that you weren't that close to, so you don't feel that sad about it, is a universal one, but one depending on who you are, I feel like is a super complicated feeling, but especially when you're a child, and are just told you should feel sad, and are devastated because you just aren't. It's really interesting seeing the usual dynamics between the boys kind of swapped because of this event, with Carl being the more sensible and seemingly reasonable one who is concerned for Hoodsie, and Hoodsie being kind of closed off and not really caring about the whole situation, or at least acting like it. You really get to see all the reasons why he shouldn't care and says he doesn't, but slowly through the episode, you see that he does. And it perfectly builds to the final, really powerful speech he gives at the funeral, where you see him grapple with the fact there are things he misses about her. And even if he isn't as sad as he thinks he should be or expects to be, he still is a little sad and misses her in his own way. Well, the craziest situation around him happens that I'm not gonna spoil, but it cuts through the tension in a hilarious way. But yeah, this is just such a raw episode that tackles two really unique experiences and uses, as told by Ginger's, best elements to its fullest advantage. What holds it back from being number one is while this is a really funny episode with some great lines and just wacky moments that cut the tension super well on top of everything else, they definitely overly rely on the comedy a little bit. And I think some of the escape artist stuff is a bit excessive and takes away from the seriousness of the episode a little. But that's a minor problem for easily one of the season's and show's best episodes. But we still have one more to go. But before we get into that, here are 5 honorable mentions. Same thing as last time, there's only a small number of episodes in this season, so I decided to talk about all of them between both videos. So you can consider the episodes in this section to be numbers 10 through 6 on a season ranking in no particular order. So this is a decent opener to the season. The follow-ups on plots from Summer of Camp Caprice are hit or miss. The Carl stuff isn't nothing of an off-screen conclusion, Sasha isn't mentioned, which is probably fine actually, and Darren going out with Miranda is an interesting follow-up to their story. This episode puts a really great first foot forward, all things considered. Darren losing his headgear and being super handsome and starting to see some popularity for the first time, creating a little bit of a rift between him and his friends, is a big status quo change that doesn't bear a lot of fruit at the moment, but does signal that the show isn't afraid to make big status quo changes like that. It's really interesting to see that experience play out and the girls' reaction to all of it. I also really like the Carl plot. Brandon is such a wonderfully annoying character, and a lot of the time, when they pair him with the boys, we get some really good results, and this is no exception. There's so many funny moments with them trying to locate Brandon's monkey, but where the story really shines is the development we get on Carl and Hoodsie. We get to see these two, who are usually interested in just doing weird and crazy things, actually start to assess what their core values and morality is, which leads to some interesting moments and starts some really interesting character development you see progress throughout the season. We also get some really nice moments between the boys, just having a really great friend dynamic. It's really sweet. You can tell they're great friends and really care about each other. I don't really have a lot to complain about with this subplot. This episode is also a lot better paced and has much more interesting and well done editing, making the episode just feel like a bigger experience. You can tell they pulled out a lot of stops to make this episode feel big and important and show that they're making improvements over season 1. Where it kinda loses me is the actual story of Darren and Miranda dating. Like, they got some interesting stuff out of this idea and do a good job demonstrating how older kids and younger teens have these stupid ideas about dating that lead to problems, and this episode does show from Ginger's end how it can feel to be a friend who feels kinda left behind by events like your best friend getting his first girlfriend, but they don't do enough with any of this. And for an episode that makes a lot of big improvements from your standard season 1 episode, it suffers from season 1's biggest problem. Interesting subject matter, weak story. All this episode really amounts to in the end of the day is Ginger being annoyed and Darren and Miranda fighting, and while there is some interesting stuff with both throughout the episode, I feel like they really needed to get into Ginger's head more to explore how she's really feeling, or vary up some of Darren and Miranda's conversations to make them less one-note and repetitive. Because as it stands, it's all very repetitive, and it just feels like a very lame middle school drama a lot of the time. But still, there's enough strong elements here for me to call this one decent. So this episode is a decent step up from the last one, and really pushes the show forward as we get to see these characters grow and evolve. Both plots really tap into a weird part of growing up, and I like them both a lot. I think Macy's struggle with watching the puberty video because she's squeamish, but also because she is afraid of growing up and thinks watching this video will make going through puberty more real, is actually a really likable and compelling one. Obviously, no matter what she does, she is gonna go through all that stuff regardless. But as I said, Macy is really likable here, and her perspective is so interesting that it still makes you very invested in seeing her friends help her get over the hump and watch this video. And their perspectives on what watching the video means for not only their social status and development, but also their own friendship is also just extremely compelling. It just really captures this oddly specific time in most children's lives and how big of an event watching the puberty in school can feel like. The Carl and Hoodsey plot also taps into a really specific time in most kids' lives as they're growing up, showing when you're in middle school gym and first have to shower with everyone else. And the thing I really appreciate about this story is that at first it could come off as one that's kinda dated. Mandatory school showers at that age, I feel like are kind of being phased out, and mandatory gym in middle school isn't a thing everywhere, especially now. And I really don't think there's anything wrong with not wanting to use public showers with a bunch of other people. Adults aren't expected typically to do this, so why are kids? I didn't take gym in middle school because I hated Phy Ed in elementary school, and I took an online course in high school to get the one Phi Ed credit I needed to graduate. So I never had to confront this struggle in real life because I didn't like gym, and if I did, I probably wouldn't have wanted to share a public shower with a bunch of people either, especially at that age. But it's a conflict no kid should really have to confront for the reasons I said. So this episode could be a lame story of him being pressured to get over his distaste for being in the middle school gym showers, but that's not exactly how the episode plays out. They don't treat Hoodsey's opinion as necessarily a bad thing, or him doing this as something he has to do. He could totally get out of it if he wants. His mother gives him an out. But through the episode playing out, he kind of questions his own values and why he doesn't want to do this, and realizes he doesn't have a particularly great reason, and feels like him being afraid to do this will lead to other bad things in the future if he doesn't get over this fear. And once he does it, he even ends up enjoying it. It's just an interesting subversion in an already pretty unique story that tackles a really unique subject matter. And there's a lot of really funny and awkward moments in both of these stories. Jonas's story about Hoodsy's dad being so pathetic, being what kind of convinces him to just go in the shower, is so funny. This episode isn't perfect, and what holds it back is that it's really slow, which is fine when the episode really goes all in on its ideas, but there's definitely scenes that could have gone further exploring things, and moments that are a bit dull, making this not one of the absolute strongest in my eyes, but still worth a mention for being really good. My development with this one has been strange, to say the least. I hated it on first watch, and thought it was a cringy mess. When I watched it again for my April Fool's video, I thought it was okay and had a newfound respect for it. But watching it a third time for this list, I liked it even more, and now consider it a pretty good episode. I still stand by pretty much all I said in that April Fool's video, so I'm not going to talk about it for too long. I'll just add that I do find the main story more interesting than I did then. I don't think it's super boring on rewatch, because even when you know what's going to happen, the jokes are so over the top and interesting, making most of the episode actually pretty entertaining. And while there are some dull moments on rewatch, it's a lot better than I made it out last time. I love how it's so obvious they're pulling something, but you can understand why Ginger would think all this is real because they do such a good job faking it. Hell, I was so caught up by how cringy it all was the first time that I bought it even though it's pretty obvious. This episode is still not perfect because Ginger's struggle with all this is still incredibly weak and a non-conflict, and there are some duller repetitive moments, and Carl's plot still starts out kind of weak. And I will say, your enjoyment of this episode will hinge on you knowing this is all a prank, so you don't just find it cringe and boring, which honestly, it is pretty obvious, but once again, I didn't realize it the first time through, so I got caught up in how cringe it all was trying to judge it that way. But they still do use the April Fool's holiday really well and have some pretty interesting stuff to say about teens in general and how they act towards each other, and Carl's story is still great and really compelling, making this a pretty strong episode overall. So this is the definition of a decent episode, and one I have the absolute least to say about. It's good. I think the concept is really interesting, Ginger wanting to connect and be friendly towards this new girl, but there being some really weird stuff around her, making the self-conscious Ginger have second thoughts, is nothing super strong, but it's still a solid story. Letitia is an interesting character too, and it's interesting seeing her home life and the reasons behind some of the weird things surrounding her, which are a legitimately good hook to get you invested into learning more about her. Also, Carl's plot is really great. It's really interesting to actually get some development on Brandon, and it's also cool to see the boys developing morality, and there's some really funny moments between the three of them as they struggle to go to this party, but want to do so because they feel guilty if they don't. It's just hilarious. I think on Ginger's end though, this episode has an interesting idea, but past a certain point doesn't do much with it. Once we learn a bit about this girl, we don't really develop her much further, and the episode plays out in a very stereotypical way. They try to throw a party for her to make her feel welcome, but oh no, no one shows up until weird things happen that cause everyone to show up, and now everyone likes Letitia and gets her. There's still some cute and funny moments throughout, but nothing that exciting. Still, when everything's said and done, I do think this one is decent and worthy of being in this list video and not the worst one. So this is the other one I've talked about before, and is also an episode that's grown on me each time I've seen it, though I was always way more positive on this one. I stand by pretty much everything I said in my Mother's and Father's Day Nicktoons ranking, and did a pretty good job explaining my thoughts on it there. But I will go back on one thing and say that, well, I still wish the episode went further with exploring Ginger and Courtney's relationship while they're both dealing with really complex feelings and situations throughout the whole episode, specifically getting into Ginger's head a bit more, as I think her portrayal and her actions are just so fascinating because of how awful she is to Courtney and kind to her mother, but is justified because it's kind of normal how she's feeling and the action she takes for your average teen. But I will say, watching it again, the episode does get a lot out of every scene of them interacting, where through smart writing choices like facial expressions and little comments you get from both the girls, you see where both of their headspaces are at a little more than I feel like I initially gave it credit for in that Nicktoons ranking. And all this does build amazingly to the great ending, where all the walls come down and you really get to explore both of these characters in such an interesting way. So overall, despite me still not finding every part of this episode the most substantive or compelling, it's still a damn good one that really tackles the idea of teens' relationship with their parents and how different that can look depending on the teen and the parent, and the complexity of maybe not appreciating a great parent enough while feeling territorial, I guess, about your own parent, and just how weird but kind of acceptable that all is. And the complexity of having a parent you love but isn't always there for you, and how these two ideas can clash when two girls' very personal stories cross. Through just these great, interesting dynamics these two characters have that's explored throughout the episode, with a solid Carl plot to boot. This episode just deals with a lot of really interesting stuff, and it was very close to making the list proper. You can consider it my honorary number 6. I really do like it a lot. But with all that said, let's finish this list and finally get into my... I know this choice was predictable, but I don't care. I know I've been critical of the show before, and even fantastic episodes like Hello Stranger and Come Back Little Seal Girl, and that's partially because this episode lets me see what this show can be at its very best. This is the perfect episode of As Told by Ginger, and here's why. The story is one of the most unique I've ever seen. In any cartoon especially, but even just in TV in general. In the 2000s, families and schools were so trigger happy to diagnose children with something to explain literally any behavioral problem, leading to many kids getting diagnosed with ADHD or ADD who probably didn't have it. Same thing with mental illness. And this problem or phenomenon is not one I've really seen many shows tackle, except for As Told by Ginger. The way this episode discusses mental health and mental health diagnosis is brilliant, through the framing device of Ginger's poem being about a girl who was so sad she wanted to be gone and then does disappear. It's very obvious what the implications are, but it's also obvious Ginger isn't depressed and just wrote a story she thought was cool and is really well written. But at the same time, it's objectively good her teacher cares enough to take her poem seriously and be concerned, because if Ginger did feel the same way that is shown off in her poem, it would be really serious. But this sadly leads to Ginger getting thrown before an opportunistic school psych and making her relationship with the people around her more awkward. Some of those people are just concerned, but others aren't. But it starts to give Ginger a really negative complex, where she doesn't have a mental illness, but feels like she's kind of being forced into having one. This episode is brilliant, because it simultaneously critiques flaws in how mental health diagnosis happens, especially at the time, taking one piece of convincing evidence above what Ginger herself actually says, but at the same time, doesn't critique Mussorgsky or her friends for being concerned, or stuff like therapy for being helpful if Ginger was actually dealing with depression. It just showcases that talking about stuff like this at this age can be complicated for so many reasons, and labels like mental illness or having a problem can get thrown around for any reason and can lead to kids having complexes they shouldn't have. The episode also showcases how hard it can be to creatively express yourself as a kid, how you may write something that is super well written and represents maybe some aspect of what you're feeling, but instead of it getting appreciated, people take it in a concerning way, which once again isn't necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes kids do write things that are concerning and people end up being right about that. But I do think we have all had moments as children where our words, actions, or even writings are taken in the worst possible way when kids just really don't understand how the world works or how serious, deeper connotations to things are. And I like through having this complex, we really get to see Ginger try to figure out how she wants to deal with all of this and what her true feelings are, which leads to her showing her mom her writing, and through that realizes she knows her own feelings better than anyone. And the fact that the people took her writing that way actually means she's a great writer who can tap into feelings that aren't necessarily her own, but she also goes to group therapy because she enjoys it. This is just such a fantastic message and conclusion, that you can use situations like this to learn more about yourself, but at the same time, you know your own feelings better than anyone, and that you shouldn't let other people put stuff like that on you. But also, therapy is just generally a good thing, and you don't need to be mentally ill or have some sort of issue, quote unquote, to take use of it. This Ginger plot is just brilliant. I cannot say that enough. And just so unique and special, and every scene is used to perfectly develop all this really fascinating stuff about Ginger's complex and the broader social issues at the time, showing how a misdiagnosis of depression can happen and the negative effects it can have on someone, but also how someone can come back from that and get something really meaningful out of the experience and learn more about themselves. Just absolutely amazing. And usually this is where I would mention how the Ginger plot is perfect, but the Carl plot is crap. But this is possibly the best Carl plot of the show as well. Well, not as serious as Ginger's story by any means, and doesn't deal with any broad social issues involving the struggle with diagnosing kids and teens with mental health issues when they may not have them. Both stories do connect through the idea of people disappearing. And while Ginger's story involves her dealing with the struggle of possibly not having control of her own feelings and identity after being given this complex, Carl's story follows him deeply questioning his own morality and values after supposedly making this weird girl named Noelle Sussman disappear. And I know I've talked about Carl's great development throughout this season in how he becomes a much more complex person who thinks more deeply about things, but this is the pinnacle of season 2 for that element. It's really upsetting seeing that Carl just thinks anyone can be expendable and just made to disappear. And when Noelle Sussman does, it's insanely compelling seeing Carl realize that this girl was super interesting and had worth, and struggles with what he thought he did and desperately tries to undo it. Yeah, it's a little silly. He obviously didn't make her disappear, but his feelings are still just as real, and she's still gone without an answer of where she's been until the end of the episode, without Carl ever getting a chance to talk to her. Once again, originally thinking she was expendable. It's just so interesting seeing this boy who previously only thinks of people in terms of categories of their worth putting them in certain boxes of how they entertain him or serve him in his life, realize that a person he didn't take the time to know much about could be so cool and interesting, and then just disappearing without a trace. And to see him grapple with the fact that people can surprise him and have worth beyond his own simple little worldview that he doesn't suspect, and that he should be more open-minded about people and just the world in general, is actually pretty complex in its own right for a kid show. And it really is just the best use of Carl as a character, and the moment where he gives up his iconic petrified eyeball to get Noelle back is one of my favorite moments from him throughout the entire show, showing that he realizes this person's worth and what he did was wrong and values that over this random object of importance, which I could never imagine him doing prior. But I believe he would do it now after all this growth. It's just so good, man. Also, his dynamic with Hoodsie while dealing with this crisis is just at its peak. There's so many little funny moments, and Noelle is such an iconic character, and every moment with her, including when Carl finally meets her, is just so wonderfully weird and random, putting an awesome bow on this story. Yes, this story is not as meaningful as the A-plot, but it's really special in its own way, and I cannot sing its praises enough. It's just as compelling, and the funnier moments in it break up how serious the main plot is really effectively for just an overall amazing episode. Along with amazing atmosphere and cool artistic decisions like how Ginger's story, the one she writes, is showcased, just make this, as I said, the perfect As Told by Ginger episode that nails every aspect of this show to a T. Nothing holds it back. This episode truly demonstrates what the show can be when you have a Ginger story that goes all in on such a unique and hard-hitting topic anyone can connect with to some extent, and a compelling Carl plot that pulls its weight and shows off why he's such a great and complex character to have his own subplots in these episodes, while making other big, ambitious writing and production decisions to push this one over the top, making this the best As Told by Ginger episode, and easily the best episode of As Told by Ginger Season 2. And with all that, the list is done. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe for more similar videos in the future. Also, tell me down below what you thought of my list and what your own would have been. Also, thanks for everyone for being so patient for these past 2 videos to come out. I really think they turned out well, and once again, I really hope you enjoyed them. And I'm very excited to talk about the controversial Season 3, and those lists should come out at some point. I'll keep you updated. It's really a bummer that As Told by Ginger was removed from Paramount Plus. It was a really easy way to watch the show, and a way to watch the show in high quality, and get footage in high quality. So how I'm gonna do that video without that easily good-looking footage accessible, we'll have to wait and see. But I will be making those Season 3 lists at some point. That's really all I have to say for now. New videos will be coming soon. So, with all that said, this has been Chocolate Guy, signing off.